To calculate the movement speed and movement direction, let's go ahead and go into the event graph. Now, inside of here, instead of starting from here, let's right click now and search for initialize and select this one called blueprint initialize animation. Now, what this event is, it's just like the begin play. If you remember, if I go back to the player base, we use this one called the begin play. What should happen if I begin playing the game? Now, in animation blueprints, this is just called blueprint initialize animation. So what happens when you initialize this blueprint? So that's the same thing. Here, what we want to do, take this function here, try get pawn owner. Let's drag from here and say is valid and go ahead and select this one with the question mark is valid. Now we're asking if the player is valid, if the player has spawned into the world. And if the player has spawned, we want to right click this, promote it to a variable and call it player pawn. And go ahead and connect this to the is valid here. Now, what we're simply doing here is we're just asking, is this pawn here, is this player, has this player spawned to the world? You can imagine Counter-Strike, when you connect, you have to select if you want to be a terrorist or a counter-terrorist. Now, if the player has not yet selected a terrorist or counter-terrorist, the player has not yet spawned into the world. So it doesn't make sense to do all of this animation code if the player has not even spawned yet. So we're just checking if the player has spawned, if the player is valid, if the player is placed inside of the world. If not, we want to wait and let's just write delay here and select this delay. So we're going to delay the code by, let's say, zero point 0.3 seconds, for example. And when this delay is complete, we're going to run this is valid again. Because if the code is not valid, if the player has not spawned yet, we don't want to get stuck here. Like if we don't add anything here, the code is just going to stop. And I don't want that. I want this player pawn variable to be set whenever the player spawns. So I'm going to keep checking if the player has spawned. So I'm going to delay the code if it's not valid. And then I'm going to rerun this again. And now we can double click on this one to create reroute nodes in order to make it a bit more organized. So something like this here. So we're keeping delaying the code if the player has not spawned until the player spawns and it will create this player pawn variable. Now we can take this player pawn variable and we can place it here. Now instead of, you can see here if you take it here, you can either get the variable or set the variable. Now in order to just do it quickly, you can hold Control and drag it in. That will get it automatically. And if you hold Alt and get it here, it will set the variable. So these are just shortcuts, holding Control and holding Alt while you drag them. Okay, so we're getting this player pawn variable. Now let's right click this variable and convert it to a validated get. Now what this does is, now let's connect it here. What this does is, again, we're checking if the player is valid, if the player has spawned, just to make sure that we're running this code only when the player has spawned. Because you can see if I compile now the code is running. And you can see this is running infinitely because we have not spawned yet. This will stop running whenever we spawn. As for this one, this will always run. The blueprint update animation will always run. And it is always nice to check if the player has spawned because we don't want to run this code whenever the player has not spawned yet. Okay, so now to calculate the movement speed, let's drag from this player pawn and let's search for velocity. And let's get this one called velocity. So this is simply the only thing we have to do actually. However, you can see if I go back here in the animation blueprint and I go back to my idle run state, you can see the plugin it wants, the input it wants, it is a float type variable. It is not a vector. You can see if I go back to my event graph, this is a vector. So they don't really, we can't really plug it into here. What we can do in order to turn a vector into a float, we can drag from this one and search for length. And we can choose this one called vector length. That will actually turn it into a float type variable. And we can right click this and promote this to a variable now and call it movement speed. Now let's connect it here to the isValid. And now we have the movement speed. This is actually very easy. That's how you do it. You get the velocity of the player. We did the vector length because we want to turn the vector variable into a float variable. And then we have the movement speed here. Now, in order to calculate the movement direction, we can drag from here and search for calculate. And you can see this one called calculate direction. Select this one. Now it asks for a rotation. So what you can do is you can drag from the player and search for actor rotation and select this one, get actor rotation. Now let's go ahead and plug it in. Now, if you're very new to Blueprint, sometimes you don't know what these functions are called. And if it asks for rotation, for example, you can just drag from here and you can write rotation. And this is what I did when I started out, when I was fully new. I just wrote rotation and I tried to read what all of these functions were. And then after that, I select from those. Now, it will take a bit of time if you're new. However, this is just done over and over again and it will become muscle memory for you. So don't worry about it. Just keep practicing. So we're getting the actual rotation. We're plugging it into here. We're calculating the direction. And now we can right click this one, promote this to a variable and call it movement direction. Okay, so now we have calculated the movement speed and the movement direction as well. So let's go ahead and compile. And now we have this code here. Let's go to the idle run state here. Again, you can click on the animation graph. You can also click on the animation graph over here or go to the idle run state over here to the left. And inside of here, let's drag our movement speed, plug it into the movement speed and drag the movement direction, plug it into the movement direction, and let's go ahead and compile. So now before we can play, you can see if I play now, nothing is going to happen because we haven't used the animation blueprint in the player. So let's go to the player base, go to the viewport, click on the player or on the mesh over here. And up here, you can see animation mode, use animation blueprint. That is correct. The animation class, we have to select our blueprint and let us click on compile. And now you can see the player is animated here in the viewport as well. Now let's click on play and let's try it out. If I click on W to move forward, S to move backward, and I move to the sides as well, I move to all of the other sides, you can see it is working correctly. So awesome. The animations we have plugged in is working correctly. Now, as for the movement speed, we are going to change those later on, so don't worry about it. I can also see that the player is actually really small compared to the environment, so we have to fix that as well. But let's not worry about that for now. Everything is working correctly. And let's jump over to the next lesson and create the crouch.